Let's look at the process through which plants increase their stem girth, or thickness, through a process called secondary growth. Now, before we get into how this process occurs and what occurs during this process, we need to first look at why it occurs, why plants increase their stem girth indefinitely. So, we need to look at a concept called indeterminate growth. Indeterminate growth. And indeterminate growth is exactly what it sounds like. Plants grow indeterminately and indefinitely vertically, meaning that they don't have a cap to their growth. They continue to grow upward as much as they need to, because they have something called meristems. And meristems are basically groups of stem cells that provide the fodder for specialized and differentiated cells in the plant. And when I say stem cells, I'm not talking about like root cells, leaf cells, stem cells. I mean stem cells as in like baby embryo stem cells that can differentiate into any kind of cell. So in plants, there are two types of meristems. One is responsible for vertical growth, and we call this the apical meristem. And there are also the lateral meristems. Lateral. Think longitude, latitude. Latitude is horizontal, lateral is horizontal. So what's the relationship between secondary growth and indeterminate growth? Well, imagine that we have a tree that's 5 feet tall and another tree that's 100 feet tall. Well, obviously the 100 feet tall tree has more cells to feed. Therefore, in order to compensate for its extra cells, it will develop layer upon layer of xylem and phloem to deliver more nutrients to those cells. And by the way, just to review, xylem transports water and phloem transports sugar. So secondary growth is really a response to indeterminate growth. Secondary growth occurs because the extra cells from indeterminate vertical growth require more xylem and phloem to develop. And this xylem and phloem creates thickening in the stem, and that is secondary growth. That is one of the primary reasons we have secondary growth. The other reason is structural support, but yeah, we don't need to go into that. Anyway, so let's look at a newly developed stem. We have pith in the middle, and pith is just ground tissue, so we'll leave that yellow. By the way, ground tissue is simply tissue that is not vascular or dermal. And vascular tissue is xylem and phloem. Dermal tissue is like the skin of the tree or skin of the plant. It goes on the outside. Think like dermatology or dermatologist skin. And another green layer. This will be the phloem, primary phloem. Primary phloem. And beyond that, we have the cortex, which is also ground tissue, by the way. Cortex and the epidermis and the periderm. Epidermis and the periderm are dermal tissue. But these layers are beyond the primary phloem, and we're more concerned about this green area right here, because this is where the action happens for secondary growth. This is actually a cross section of amputated trunk, I suppose. So this is the bird's eye view. This is what we would see if we cut open a tree. And so this ring actually goes all the way around, and this ring has a very special name. It's called the vascular cambium. Spell that out. Vascular cambium. And we'll go right here. And the vascular cambium divides and differentiates into xylem and phloem cells. Only we don't call them primary xylem and primary phloem cells, the ones that divide from the vascular cambium. We call them secondary xylem and secondary phloem. So this is secondary xylem, and this is secondary phloem. So as the plant divides, the cells in the vascular cambium can also divide perpendicularly relative to the orientation of the plant. So they can also divide this way. Remember, this is a cross section. This is what we would see if we were looking up from above. So they would develop like this. And these cells that are elongated perpendicularly are called vascular rays. Vascular rays. And vascular arrays, they transport water and nutrients between the secondary xylem and the secondary phloem. They're not really essential to understanding secondary growth, but they are essential to understanding what a stem looks like. So I just included that for thoroughness. Now let's say we zoomed in on this circled area right there. So let's redraw that circle and we'll see what's inside. So here's our circle, and inside our circle we have our ring, our vascular cambium, and we label these cells, these stem cells, as initial cell. Yeah, I mean initial as in like first one initial. So initial stem cells. Now over time, if we observe these cells, they could divide like this. I'll divide and create another initial cell, and we have two initial stem cells. Now, why, you ask, would an initial stem cell divide and create two initial stem cells if the point of a stem cell is to create specialized and differentiated cells? Well, let's look back at our diagram. See, notice that as secondary xylem and secondary phloem form, the overall circumference of the stem will increase. Therefore, the vascular cambium also needs to increase in circumference. Otherwise, if everything else was expanding and only vascular cambium remained constant, well, then we would have it would start to break apart, and we'd have fragments all over the place. And this wouldn't be good, because then over here we'd have more development, over here we'd have more development, but in this gap area we would not have any xylem or phloem forming. And so this would translate into a very bulgy and unstable trunk, and that wouldn't be good for the stability of the plant. So that's why we have initial cells dividing into more initial stem cells, so we can maintain a uniform distribution. Anyway, initial cells can also develop and create derivative cells. And a derivative cell is basically just a xylem or a phloem cell. And let's draw a xylem here. So this thing right here, this is the derivative cell. It's a DER and IVATIVE, but I don't have any space. And the derivative cell is the mother to a whole new line of cells. So this xylem right here, it's the mother to a whole new line of xylem cells. And if it were a phloem cell, it would be the mother to a whole new line of phloem cells. Okay, now back to our diagram. Notice that as secondary xylem accumulates, it accumulates on the inside of the plant. As xylem grows older, it moves closer to the center of the plant relative to the vascular cambium. And over time, as xylem gets older, it loses its ability to transport water and dissolve minerals, and the xylem is essentially dead. However, it's not completely useless though. It forms a very sturdy structure in the center of the plant known as heartwood, and heartwood is basically just dead xylem. And the heartwood is a contrast to the sapwood, which is the newest layer of secondary xylem, which still transports water and dissolved minerals. Phloem is a different story. Phloem also gets pushed outward because, see, it makes intuitive sense. We have xylem accumulate on the outside, it pushes out the vascular cambium, and the older layers of phloem also, accumulate over here, and it pushes out the phloem over here. So it gets pushed out. And and by the way, this area from the vascular cambium all the way out to the epidermis and periderm, this is called bark. So, bark. So as more phloem accumulates, it pushes out the older phloem onto the outer edge of the bark, where it's chipped away by the environment or by humans, or sometimes it just dries up and chips off on its own. Nevertheless, the older phloem gets chipped off, and only the newest phloem remains to transport sugar and other nutrients to the plant. Now, you may be wondering, okay, well, the whole point of secondary growth was to accommodate indeterminate vertical growth, so what's the point of secondary growth if phloem and xylem just die off? Well, keep in mind that the vascular cambium produces more and more vascular tissue every year. So let's say this is year 1, this is year 2, and this is year 3, it produces that much. So every year it increases the amount of vascular tissue it produces, and that extra amount compensates for the amount of tissue that dies or joins the heartwood. And so that's secondary growth, and thank you for watching.